Yo, my peoples, what's up? Welcome back to Shelf Stories, channel that tells tales from games, books, and life. I'm your host, Jason. Thank you so much for stopping by for the latest episode of Good Trouble. Yes, I'm back with Good Trouble. I just made my guest over here happy. He likes causing good trouble. He knows what we're talking about over here. It is the program where I engage in above the table essential conversations that I feel are necessary, especially in the culture space, in a spirit of education and compassion. No trolling here. This is all about education. And I have the perfect gentleman when it comes to education, a philosophy professor. He is paid for this stuff. A philosophy professor that is no higher level of education. Ask me, I'm a philosophy major, so of course I'm going to say that. He is the author of Culture and Ancestry in 5th edition. It is a supplement that is released on Arcanist Press. You can go purchase it from Drive-Thru RPG. I'll include a link in the show notes. There's also supplemental material and a very, very deep thinker when it comes to culture, ancestry, all that stuff. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eugene Marshall. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's great. That's very kind.
All right. I'm so pumped about this because the article, or not the article, but the supplement, Culture and Ancestry, came out last year, June 2020, right in the middle of everything. George Floyd, in the larger universe, so Black Lives Matter and that kind of thing, but also, so this is a board gaming channel, but your supplement is focused on Dungeons and Dragons and role playing in general. So there was a reckoning within Dungeons and Dragons about how it presents races and cultures, and there's a lot of stereotypes. Let's just go right for it. The way it's presented over since Gary Gygax on down, there's a lot of stereotypes that got stuck in there. And if you don't believe that, then listen to the show. We will explain about stereotypes and racism, everything that's happening. So let's do a 101. Let's start with you, Dr. Eugene Marshall, and then talk about Arcanist Press and that project, and then we can move on to the supplement.
Okay, so I'm the author and co-owner of Arcanist Press, which was created last February 2020 when I launched a Kickstarter for this product, Ancestry and Culture, an alternative to race in 5e, thinking it would be something tiny. I set a goal of $300, but it just blew up. It got $8,000 in 2 weeks, and so then I thought, oh wow, there's a bigger audience than I realized. And the thing is, I wasn't even planning on selling it at all. The story behind the product is this: I had been playing since the early '80s, Redbox, Mensa edition.
Yep.
And
me too. Yeah. Was that first edition or second?
It's the basic set. So it came out around this. It was an alternative. It was a kind of a newbie intro to D&D during the AD&D era, and the idea would be you'd play basic and one of those, in the basic, expert, whatever series, and then you'd graduate to advanced D&D. But I didn't, because I like the basic system better. But so I've been playing for a long time, and I, look, white person here. So I kind of grew up not noticing the problems, but I when I came back to play, because I took about a 10-year hiatus for grad school and kids and stuff, in 2014 with 5th edition, I started reading about it, and I started reading bloggers and essayists like N.K. Jemisin wrote this great thing about 10 years ago called The Unbearable Baggage of Orking. And then you've got James Mendez Hodes and Graham Barber and all these authors of color talking about how they found the way race is handled in D&D problematic. And I kind of opened my eyes. I didn't realize it. And
we're having its reckoning in board gaming as well. So like I did the video, which I showed you, on Gloomhaven. Gloomhaven is the number one. Are you familiar with Gloomhaven?
Yeah, huge Kickstarter success, right?
Yeah, huge Kickstarter.
And then Frosthaven as well, right?
Absolutely. So then Isaac Childress, which has been very much recounted on this channel, said, okay, we need to get a cultural consultant in here to clean some of the stuff up that we did. People got mad, and in your area, so D&D. So we're very conscious about the crossover. Right. Yeah. So like, so in Dungeons and Dragons, and it's not just in Dungeons and Dragons, like it's kind of all over tabletop gaming. It's just like, that's the big one, right? It's like the big, for sure. It's like the bad year blimp in the middle of everything. So that's why we're focusing on D&D and Gloomhaven. So then, we're talking about like seeing it with new eyes, right? We're talking about seeing it, and when I grew up, I didn't see it either. Right. And it didn't take me until having experiences. And no, not indoctrinated, not like my mind was not warped. You just have to take my word for it, which is a thing that people say, right? I'm sure you've heard that a couple of times. Right. But just kind of seeing it and matching up my experience and having different experiences with other people and saying, whoa, something's wrong here. And we're going to detail that. We're going to absolutely drill down and detail on what we saw, once we looked at it with new eyes. So right. So pick it up in 2014, right? You picked it up and you had those new eyes.
Yeah, thanks to these other writers. I mean, so I do think it's important that I acknowledge they're the ones that taught me, right? But so then I just was playing around. So in 2019, some people like, well, let's see if we can fix this. And they posted some posted Tristan Tarwater, and for other people posted attempts to solve it, like fix the mechanics of race on D&D Beyond. I liked what they're doing, but I thought I could try and do something different. So I wrote something up, showed it to a friend, and he said, oh my God, you should put this online or publish it. It's great. So there was that zine quest in February, and I thought, well, I'll just throw that up there, and it ended up exploding. And and so all of this was coming out of just the ongoing conversation about the problematic nature of orcs in D&D and racism. And then it just so happened that like it took me X number of months to produce the Kickstarter, and I released it like the week where Black Lives Matter kind of resurged into the mainstream attention. And so that was just, an accident. Just
came right together. Right.
Right. And it ended up being really fortuitous. And then a few weeks after that, Wizards of the Coast, I'm not saying they were responding to my book. They were responding to the ongoing conversation in the community, said, look, we recognize we've done a bad job with race, and we're going to try and do better. Keep your eyes open for future books. And, there's been some sign of some progress. They're the big ship. And so it takes a long time to change directions.
Right.
But a few months later, they released Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which had a small, but
it was a first down. It was it wasn't a touchdown. It was a first down. It was like we moved the marker a little bit forward.
Yeah.
We will get to that. We will get to that. What that is.
So the conversation was ongoing right when this came out. So it ended up having kind of a splash for that reason.
Right. Okay, so there it is, and I'm showing at various points. I'm going to show the actual book. You can get it. It's on DriveThruRPG, the PDF, right? It never was printed, was it?
No, you can get it printed. Print on demand from DriveThru too. Yeah.
Okay, so print on demand.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not like a supplement you could buy.
It's not in stores or anything.
It looks like one. It's laid out like one. So
that Kickstarter money, that's where that went to. I wanted to make it because I thought if it looked professional,
right,
people would take it a little more seriously. So,
absolutely. Okay. So before we get to what's in that supplement, though, we should probably articulate the problem, because obviously, I've done videos about this problem, but people just don't get it. And it's not like I'm not accusing anybody of being like dumb or anything. It's just you're in a mindset. You grow up in a mindset. You grow up with certain ideas, all the time. It's like, okay, D&D is my escape from real life, and it's just fantasy, and it's just a game, and all these kind of like different ways in which we believe that D&D and fantasy and things like Gloomhaven or the big products are kind of sectioned off from what's going on in the real world. And what this project is saying, okay, those barriers are not as solid as you think. Stuff gets in. The problematic stuff that happens gets in. So talk a little bit about the problem itself.
Yep.
And then we can move on.
There's a couple ways. There's a couple parts to the problem, really. And let me talk about one of them. So look, it just so happens that in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons and many other of the editions and fantasy gaming and storytelling really in general, there are often races of people, or if you prefer, lineages or species or civilizations or groups of people that are described as by nature, like in their blood, by birth, evil or ignorant and unintelligent or savage. And that in many of those story worlds, including D&D, often at least, they are presented as really, there's only two things you can do with them. You can conquer and enslave them, or you can eradicate them, right? What do you do with an orc horde? You don't make in often traditional storytelling, you don't like make a diplomacy with them, right? You have to conquer them because that's all they understand, right? Okay.
And
fine.
it's the by nature thing. And I've talked about this many times.
Yep.
And it's like when we talk about, there is racism in these products, what we're talking about is like, I think people go to like, okay, they did it on purpose and they intentionally did it. It's like, okay, are you calling the people that wrote D&D racist? No, it's not about race. It's about bias. And our bias in the way we tell stories is that we, especially when it's like out groups, like, when we're doing non, like whatever it is, males or whatever it is, or that, we tend to talk in terms of this nature category. And that's what race is all about.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, so the problem, right, is that you've got a storytelling technique in this world, and says, hey, this is a group of people that is simply born to be conquered, defeated. They're born savage, ignorant, and evil. And here's the problem with that. Okay, look, you might say, yeah, but they're not humans. You're not saying this of a group of humans. They're made up people. Who cares? Fine. I get that. But here's the problem. Let's say you're a player and you have experienced that attitude in real life, right? You've suffered in some way because of real world racism. Now you sit down and none of us are stupid. We know that orcs aren't humans. So you might think, well, that's different. Here's the problem. If you experience something awful in your real world life every day, you might not want to have to play act it again when you sit down for your game. So, but the problem is that D&D kind of shoves it in your face. You can't, if you sit down and you want to play a half orc, you're just looking through the races and you're like, well, it could be a half orc. Oh, by nature, they are savage and intimidating and menacing, and that's just who they are.
Minus
right?
2 intelligence. Yeah. I went
yeah.
through the
Right.
whole thing, yeah.
Right. So you're like, oh, that's kind of a bummer. And then again, if you read some of the texts, even in 5th edition, but also in earlier editions, it's implied that half orcs only come about through rape. So this is not the orc people are not people that they're depicted as lesser. They're depicted as worthy of conquest only or enslavement. And as N.K. Jemisin put it in her essay, she says, you know what, for somebody like her, she says, this sounds familiar. They're almost people, but they need to be civilized by, the more advanced peoples of the world. And she's like, oh, this again, right? So that kind of turns a lot of people off. They're just like, oh, I don't really want to play act racism. I live it, right? It's not fun, right? So I will say that if there's a person who's not experienced racism and they're saying, this is baloney, we shouldn't worry about this. I think, you want my opinion as a white person, those people should shut the heck up.
Okay, so
what the heck do they know? I'm sorry, I know that's quite confrontational, and maybe that should be edited out if that's what you prefer. But let me just say, they should shut the heck up for a second and think, because let me make an analogy that might help. Imagine that you have suffered some other injustice. Let's say you have suffered, unfortunately, let's say you've suffered sexual assault in your life, and it was a traumatic thing. Or let's say you were a prisoner of war and you were mistreated. You then sit down to just have a fun game with your friends, and they pull out, it's the torture the prisoners of war game, right? You're like, it's the let's sexually assault people game. And you might think, that might stir up old bad memories. That might make you uncomfortable. You might not be able to have fun play acting something that is so closely associated with like pain and suffering that you experienced. But when you sit down to make a D&D character, you kind of are stuck with the fact that, well, in the D&D world, people just are smart or stupid, savage or civilized because of their DNA or because who their parents are. Doesn't matter what, you can take an orc and teach them whatever you want. They're still dumb savages. Mm-hmm. And so some people are like, I live that. I don't want to play it. And that's a way in which it's not that, that's one way in which the game can be less welcoming, less inclusive, less open to people that have suffered those things in the real world. So I'm thinking like, look, I would like D&D to be open and available and welcoming and fun for anybody who wants to play. I want the community to grow and be more successful, because if I want to speak in an entirely mercenary way, more people playing means more books sold, means more money for the company, means more books produced. I like D&D books. Also, there's the moral issue. It's like, well, I don't want to exclude somebody that I could play with. That's no fun, right?
Mm-hmm.
I want anybody to be welcome at the table. So if there's a part of the game that makes people say, oh, that's a drag. Every time that comes up, I'm like, oh yeah, that time that I was treated that way. Not that you were treated like an orc, but that the same assumption was made about you or about your family or about somebody, your heritage, right? You might think, oh, that's kind of a drag. I had to suffer that. And now I got to pretend I got to go out. I wanted to play a tiefling and now I got to go out and deal with people being racist against me in my games. Can I just have a break for a minute? Right. So that was the thinking I was coming up with. That's like, this is a problem that some people encounter that makes it less fun for them to play.
Okay, now, so let's actually, I want to pause on that for just for a second, because I think that maybe among the comments that I got when I released my video was, it's it's not really there. I don't see it, therefore it's not there type thing. Like, I have you encountered that as you have, posted and, that's ridiculous. Like, so I did an example in Gloomhaven. There was, there's a creature called Vermlings. Right. And the Vermlings they're basically rodent creatures, vermin. Mm-hmm. And they are what I think, and this is one of the contentious things, right? So I think it's pretty clear, but it's like coded along like Native American, tropes, right? So like they were there, and then the humans came in and conquered them, and they dispelled them from the land, and they even have like shamanistic and like kind of native tropes. And if you read deeper into the lore, then it's like, okay, they're garbage eating savages, and they're barely above intelligent, and it's like, I'm sitting there as a person who is, very into this stuff going, oh, come on. It's screaming right in the face. But then I get all this pushback in my comment section saying, you're looking into it. It's clearly not there. So I'm not like, have you encountered that, and how do you deal with that pushback?
Yeah, that's easy. I mean, so I totally get what they're saying. And there's an old like argument that's been going on when people talk about how to interpret art or a book or a movie, that they think that it has to be the authorial intent is what matters.
Authorial intent. Yeah. Okay.
Right. And that's not true, right? Things can really be a feature of a movie or a book or a piece of art or game unintentionally. So let me give you another analogy. Let's say you, let me give an example here. Let's say you are watching a movie, and the movie is supposed to be funny, but there's the scene where there's all these clowns that like come up and get in your face and are laughing. And well, maybe it's, because that can be kind of scary actually, or kind of like, creepy or something. Sure. Okay. Well, they didn't intend it that way, but it ended up being really creepy. Or movies, they're trying to be really serious and you just end up laughing at them. Right. So that happens all the time. Right. And to say that, well, they didn't mean it to be ridiculous doesn't mean it's not ridiculous, right? And doesn't mean it can't make people in the theater laugh. Well, similarly, somebody might be trying to be, you want another one? Go back and watch some movies from the 80s and before, and you'll see things that even nowadays, by our sensibilities, you might make you cringe. You're like, like go back and watch, what is it? 16 Candles. There's like an Asian exchange student called Long Duck Dong. And, he has the ridiculous accent that's a parody, and it's racist. It just is. And, they weren't trying to be racist. They just were trying to make jokes. You want to go back further, go to Breakfast at Tiffany's, where Mickey Rooney played a Japanese guy, Mickey Rooney, a white man. And it's gross. It's pretty racist. There's no avoiding it. That's bad.
Yeah. And that's
something they weren't intending it.
We're having a hard time with distinguishing, like, okay, they didn't mean it, from like, it's racist anyway. Like we didn't say, and that's something I've been over backwards to say.
Here's the thing. Another thing is, it's the difference between saying the product is racist and the author is racist. Right. They can argue that author's not racist. They didn't mean that. Okay, fine. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they aren't. But the product might be.
Or the audience is racist for liking it.
That is one thing that people will say.
That's a big thing. That's like, oh, are you calling me racist because I like this thing? It's like, oh, I will never call people racist. However, please, let's just try to take those labels aside and look at the thing.
Yeah, right. No, that's, people identify with this. This is their hobby. They love a thing. And when you're pointing out something problematic about it, they take it as a critique of them. You know what it sounds a lot like to me? When somebody says, I love my country, but here's something that could be better. And then somebody says, how dare you?
love it or leave it.
Yeah. And it's like, well,
Right.
are we like that with people? Like if my spouse makes a mistake, I'm like, well, it's a divorce. I can't say, or do I just have to say, no, that's not a mistake. No, grown-ups are able to both love something and see the ways in which it's imperfect. I don't see so, but people take it as an attack on them, and they sometimes their emotions get the better of them, and they don't respond in a way that is mature.
And they'll take an attack on them, right? And that clouds the ability to talk about it. And then there's that specter of cancellation, right?
Yeah,
like we're taking it away. So now we can transition to another aspect of your project, right? So what you are doing is what I called rearrange the dots, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's the D&D presents a bunch of dots, and what you're doing is you're dislocating and rearranging things. You're not actually removing things. So let's talk about what you're doing, and then talk about it in terms of that broader, well, I mean, it's the broader context of like quote unquote cancellation, but let's talk about now, we can drill down on what you actually do to try to help this situation.
Okay. So first of all, the way I presented the product is always, this is an optional supplement. I, in the product, do not say anybody who's playing D&D as written is a racist or is awful. No, that's not true. Right. I'm simply saying that this is something that the first part of the book, as you know, is an essay that's explaining why I thought this was worth doing. And then the rest of the book is like, and if you think that you would like to make an alternative available, maybe you've got players who are like, I don't want to play act racism again. Here's a way to solve it. But the thing that's nice about what I think it works for the thing is it's plug and play, and it really doesn't change anything if you don't want to use the specific rules. Like if you want to play just a traditional elf, just like in the player's handbook, instead of choosing elf race, you chose elf ancestry and culture, and it's literally identical. It's just elf. Right. So it doesn't actually impact you at all if you don't choose to engage with that rule. Think of it like an optional rule in the sidebar in the DMG. You know, it's like, well, you could do variant encumbrance if you want. I'm not forcing everyone to use variant encumbrance. I'm saying that if that's your jam, here it is. And it's super easy to just swap this out because that allows you, maybe you want to play Aragorn from Tolkien, and you want to be a human raised by elves, but you want it reflected, mechanically. And so then you choose human ancestry, elf culture.
So break that down. So what you've done is, here's what you've done. You've taken race, right? And race is this kind of sloppy agglomeration of what we call ancestry and culture, the nature and nurture.
Yep.
Right. What race is basically this cake of nature and nurture together.
Yep.
And we don't differentiate it. And it's also like hierarchical. Like we never talk about race in terms of like equal race. We always talk about it in terms of hierarchy, right? Human race, and then all the other races, or whatever, however that works. So then you took race and you split it off into ancestry and culture.
Yes. So, I mean, if you actually look at the category race is a mechanical term and concept in Dungeons and Dragons that picks out a set of traits, right? So it's like an ability score increase. It's a speed, it's a size, it's something about your age, like how the average age of that members of that race. And then it gives you a couple specialized traits like darkvision or fey ancestry or gnome cunning or whatever, right? That's it. That's what race is in D&D. So, but the thing is, if you look at the list of things, some of them are obviously biological, like whether you have wings of the Aarakocra, gills of the Triton, dark vision eyes of the elf. Fey ancestry is about literally the fact that you have descended from elves that came from the Feywild or whatever the story is. But then others are obviously not, like elf weapon training.
Right.
Well, you had to be trained or language. Elves aren't born knowing Elvish. They have to be taught it, just like everyone else has to be taught language.
Bonus language and all that.
Right. So, or a skill proficiency, like the dwarves having proficiency with Smith's tools, right? They're not. I mean, you can tell a story where they're literally born knowing how to smith or something, but that's not generally the way that we think about a skill proficiency. So all I did was I just said for each one, I said, well, let's just put all the biological ones under a new category called ancestry, and all the cultural ones, the ones that are taught, under a category called culture. And then you can mix and match. Even if you don't mix and match, you're at least acknowledging that, hey, the fact that whatever elves are more dexterous or more intelligent or something isn't inborn. It's not innate. It's just that they have a culture that values learning, right? And so that takes what's called the essentialism out of the way you talk about race in the game. The essentialism being the idea that it's part of the essential nature of the people to be a certain way. You see this in American culture or in global culture, where people might say members of that ethnicity or race they're really good at sports, or they're really smart, or they're lazy, or they're hardworking, right? You get those are stereotypes.
Sure.
And the thing that we do in D&D without thinking about it is we just say that's an okay way to talk about people, because orcs just are stupid and savage,
no matter where they are, no matter where they're born, no matter who they're born to. It's always barbaric and menacing. And
there's a very famous scene, well, if you move in certain circles, in an R.A. Salvatore book where Dritz Jordan, his famous Drow Ranger, is
I love how you do the dual wield when you talk
the dual wielding, right? So has the encounters, like there's a fight, they slay some orcs, but then they find orc babies, and one of his companions is like getting ready to kill them, and Dritz stops, because Dritz, of course, is a drow, and so he is the kind of person that others thought was by nature evil, but he knows that if it put in the right circumstances, different cultural contexts, people can make different choices. And so he stops her from killing the baby orcs. And it's actually, like, to Salvatore's credit, I think it's, and this was written, years ago. Sure. And it's a nice note. And it's really just what I'm trying to make, the same sort of point here. And it doesn't mean that if you want to play the traditional game, you are a racist. And it doesn't mean that the people who created, I do not think that the lead rules designer and lore people over at Wizards of the Coast are racists because they wrote this game. Not at all. I just think that there's elements of it that can make some people not be able to enjoy the game as much. It's really, it's almost not, I don't see how it's all that different, really, from when you point out to a game designer, oh, did you know this board is really hard to read for colorblind people? You know what I mean? You're like, you might not know this, but you actually make the game harder to play for some people by insisting that a whole race of people can be evil and worthy of just eradication. Because, we used to talk that way about, the Germans talked that way once about 75 years ago. We didn't like that. Do we need to talk that way? It's kind of gross. Somebody might say, right?
I used an example in a follow-up video about George R. Martin, the way he wrote Tyrion Lannister in the very first Game of Thrones. This was in the late 90s, I think. Enter scene Tyrion, the first time you see him, and this is before everything that happened. Tyrion is like sitting on a door, and he does like a backflip and like a little tumble off of the door, and it's like, ta-da, I'm Tyrion, I'm here. And like, it was like, he apparently, like, this was if there was one thing that GR can change, it would be that scene, because it was like he was just kind of going off the little man stereotype of like, okay, they're all flippy and everything like that. So it's like, okay, he got feedback from people who are like, that's not our life. Like, that's not what we do. Like, we're in a lot of pain, actually, oftentimes. And he ended up writing that into the story, into the later stories. And he ended up being able to say, okay, my father sees me like that, and that's a problem, you know, and that and actually creates more. It makes it, by having that check and, making it more real life, it actually it makes the story richer. And some of the pushback I get is like, okay, we have to keep, like, authorial, not just authorial intent, but like authorial autonomy, right? We can't like put this stuff on the author. We want them to be free to make what they want. Although that's how we get good stuff. I get that to an extent, but it's like, what about like, okay, how about bringing real life to the author? I thought, don't authors want to make things that are, resonant with real people, as an act of empathy? So it's like, okay, here's and it just kind of multiplies over and over again. Like, we need to be able to bring these personal experiences, and if the author does something with it, then that's the best of both worlds.
No, I think that's right. I mean, and if you want to be mercenary about it, again, it's just good business, right? Like, why would you make a product that you want to sell as many copies of as possible, have stuff built into it that turns a percentage of your audience off and makes them not interested in it? That's just not good business. And set the money aside. I mean, I'd like to think that most of us want the game to be something that anybody can enjoy. And if you had, imagine if in the game you had like I said, some other unpleasant elements that alienated a portion of your audience because it just didn't, it's written in a way that other people just didn't realize. And, if people complain, I mean, I will say that, well, the creators themselves, at least for the past few editions, the creators of third and fourth edition too, generally agree with this move to make these changes.
So you talk about like being good business. You talk about, okay, why alienate part of your audience? I think there's a core of people who believe, and maybe it's like more than a core. I mean, it's a lot of comments that I get that, like, by, quote unquote, changing, canceling or whatever, then we're making it good for this audience, but it kind of like making it worse for the original audience, right? We're making it safer. We're making it, we're taking things out, canceling, and it's just, you can't please everybody. So when you try to please everybody, you're going to please nobody. You end up with like a blank mush, right? So then,
how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I don't want to lead you into that because I'm tossing meatballs over here.
No, I'm happy. I mean, I get that. Like, oh, I see how it is. They're more blah, blah. Okay. Well, two things. One, I mean, I would ask somebody who feels that way to honestly imagine the situation we're talking about here, just for a second, with some empathy. Imagine you sit down right? You sit down with a friend and you pull out a game that they haven't played and you have, and you like the game. And it just so happens that there's one part they're like, oh man, that's really gross or whatever, or like, I hate the way that figure looks. Can we take it out and play something else? Or like, just like substitute something else for it that doesn't bother me as much or whatever. Or I'm colorblind, I need you to change that. That person is being like, you're removing a barrier from them getting to enjoy the game with you. And if I really don't think that in most cases, removing that barrier so your friend can play doesn't, like, well, that just ruins the game for me. I mean, if I don't have those closely, like that particular mini or this particular color pattern, I don't like this game anymore. You're going to prevent me from playing because of your color blindness. Most people aren't going to say that. They're just going to be like, all right, well, whatever. I mean, I like the other colors a little better, but I don't mind if they make a change that's just allows more people to play. I really don't think any of these people sit down and read a fantasy book and say, I liked that, but it needed a lot more racism in it. Don't you think? Like, why wasn't there more slavery in that story? I really don't think that's how they think. I mean, maybe there's a very small percentage that are actually racist people that think that, but most of the people right. Most of the people that we're talking about are people that feel like they don't understand why you're making these changes, and they don't, they think it's like, you're making a mountain out of a molehill sort of thing. But, I'd ask them again, just like, well, I mean, imagine if it's prevented you from playing, you might care a little more, and changing it so the other person can play doesn't prevent you from playing.
If you do the change as well.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's true. Obviously it can be done poorly. Absolutely. It can be done poorly. I'd like to point out as well that at least the changes I made, if you don't like that part, you can still play the elfiest elf that ever elfed. Right. There's no one's preventing you from playing an elf, and elves are not suddenly not any different anymore from dwarves and orcs and halflings. It doesn't make them all the same. It doesn't turn everything into homogenous, boring, safe, right? You can still have your elves be very different from your halflings. Halflings are still size small. Elves are still generally size medium. Elves have dark vision. Halflings don't. Elves have fey ancestry. Halflings don't. You see what I mean? Like,
so drill down on that. I think people need to be reassured on that level of like, because we talked about before the call of like, okay, what are you going to do? Take race out? That I think that the line is, okay, you're taking the racism out by taking the race out. And now we're all kind of funny looking humans. And they drill down on that. Reassure the peoples, Eugene. You reassure the peoples.
Okay. So I can do that. So at least in the rules I make, and what happened, all the traits are still the same. All I'm saying is that elves get some of their traits from their parents, and some of their traits they're taught when they grow up. But the end product is still as Legolas as you want it to be, right? With your dwarves, right? Same thing, right? You get your Gimli and your Legolas produced. All it says is two things. It reassures the reader, or it makes it clearer to the reader. Hey, these behaviors are taught. They're not inborn. That's all. That's the one major thing it does. It just changes the way we talk about it so that that's clearer. And then the second thing is, by doing that, we do allow people to mix and match and have a little more flexibility with their characters. And that would be, like I said, Aragorn, the human raised by elves. So he knows Elvish and he has some elven abilities that like he knows some, healing herbs and stuff like this that other humans don't, because he's taught them. And so, right, that's all that does. So yeah, it is true that you will occasionally get the character that's kind of a mix, dwarf raised by elves or gnomes raised by halflings. And that might be a little unusual and a little bit more complicated than the simple, there's the 7 players handbook races or whatever, but it's really not that weird. And in fact, it makes for a lot better story. And it's kind of hard to imagine how that couldn't happen. Are you trying to tell me that in the thousands of years of, say, for example, the Forgotten Realms, there was never a dwarf adopted by elves? Like they find a dwarf baby and they raise it, or vice versa, and that product of the person that was, that's the result of that is going to be kind of a mix.
Or it happens in real life where you're like, I follow a lot of mixed martial art, right? And in mixed martial arts, you'll have this weird thing sometimes where it's like a sensei will move, let's say a sensei from East Asia will move into like Denmark, and then we'll train like a school of like these badass, badass martial artists in that tradition, but they're from Denmark, and it's like that happens all the time in real life. So like you might have the equivalent would be like, you're an orc, but that particular brand of orcs migrated to the base of a wizard tower.
Right.
And now, they have orc stuff, which is the tusks and the eyes and they have the green skin, whatever you have, but they don't have menacing and, whatever those traits are.
Right.
Menacing or what are the ones? Powerful build,
savage attacks and
bloodlust
are the two. Yeah.
A bloodlust,
for half
whatever.
Orcs, at least. Yeah.
And the minus stat. So like in 5th edition, if you play
Full
like
orcs,
an orc,
yeah.
a full orc, a half orc doesn't have that, but in 5th edition,
right.
I don't know if they used to, but like the orc definitely had the -2 int. So like, you no longer have the -2 int. You would now might have a +2 int, and or your +2 int would come from culture.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah. So it doesn't actually make, all it does is it makes some more interesting characters possible. Like I say, your Eretz or Aragorns, or if you want to use a Terry Pratchett, Carrot Iron Founderson is a human raised by dwarves. And, I distinctly remember Ed Greenwood, the creator of the Forgotten Realms, telling me, it's in print now too, and that he was talking to Terry Pratchett, creator of Discworld, famous fantasy author, and how in the D&D world, somebody like Carrot Iron Founderson is possible. Somebody who is of one ethnicity, but raised in a different culture and thus has different traits from your average person. And also that there are many cases where like more than just humans can have offspring with other people of other ancestries, right? So the creator of the Forgotten Realms is on board with this and has been since, he said that he and Terry Pratchett and Gary Gygax were talking at Gen Con in the late 70s, and they all agree that this is how it's supposed to work in D&D. And it's just that's got lost. It didn't really make it into the rule books, and then it got kind of codified over the years. But it doesn't have to be that way. It wasn't really intended to be that way, and it doesn't hurt to allow it.
Yeah, in terms of the cancel stuff, like I need to emphasize this, and you mentioned this before about like the Drist example. This stuff has been in the role-playing game since the very beginning. Like, you have, if you look at the different stat layouts for the dwarves and the elves and halflings, you always have alternates. Like you always have, like, you have your halfling, your essential halfling, and then you have like the Lightfoot halfling and the stout leaf halfling, and you have sun elves and dwarf and all these other things. And like they're there and they all have different stats and they have different, and that's what we're talking about. They're still elves because they get the biological stuff, but all the cultural stuff is different. All we're doing is trying to take the essential one out and say, okay, no, all of the races depend on the culture in which they grew up. There's certain stuff that stays there. So please, Tieflings still have darkvision people. You can still have your shark people with claws. We're not just making funny looking humans. It's just now they're different depending on where they were raised.
Exactly. And so I will say, just a side note, so that's exactly what is intended. But I also think that honestly, it's just kind of makes for better storytelling too, to change this, to make it not just essential to race. For example, I've had people say, yeah, but if you do that with orcs, you're saying that they're not inherently evil. Who are my players going to want to fight? And it's very simple. Instead of it being a horde of orcs that are evil because of their parents, it's a group of people, maybe they're mostly orcs, it doesn't really matter, who are brigands or who are mercenaries or who are led by a charismatic ruler that wants to conquer the land. You don't think there's enough potential for evil in adults making choices? Of course there is, right? It's just that when you slaughter the hordes that are attacking you or the brigands that are trying to ambush you, you do it because they're making bad decisions. They're making evil choices, not because of their DNA is evil or because you would have slaughtered them when they were a baby. You know, you don't have, that's lazy storytelling. It's much more interesting if the bad guys made a choice to be bad. Right. And so that's not changing no adventure needs to get thrown out because if you can just say, well, they chose to be in the horde.
And it's funny, like, you know, because Star Trek has the same problem, right? So it's like you have the races and like the Ferengi are always this and the Klingons are always this. And when they come on the scene, they are. But then you get into it and you tell more stories and, you know, and you get into like, you know, the different characters, they always flesh out. Yeah. So it's like we always get there. Well, not always, but like we often get there, especially when you get into the weeds of the better storytellers. Yeah. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to like make that initial encounter with an orc or an elf or a Ferengi, or we're trying to make that initial encounter, like you said before, like make people think twice about like, okay, why are they?
I just think it's, I happen to think it's more interesting storytelling. Another trope that people like to probably maybe aren't aware of if they're not thinking about this or living it is this trope of like the good X. So there's this idea, and this is something that some people have, are a little uncomfortable with, like Drow and Drizzt, although I said Salvatore does a good job, actually, I think, of addressing some of that. But is the idea, well, they're all evil, but I know there's this one good one, and he's the exception to his race. And people used to talk that way often about like minority groups. They'd say like, what are you talking about? I'm not racist. I have a black friend or whatever. Or, well, he's one of the good ones, not like, the rest of them. That's still racist, right?
Yeah. So, or like a PC, right? Okay. I come from this race, but my PC is all complicated and everything. Like my character that I'm invested in, and speaking, going back to Gloomhaven, like, my Vermling is awesome. My Vermling is badass. And he does this and the third thing. So therefore it can't be racist because like I can make a cool Vermling.
Yeah, you can play an orc. You're not racist. Right. Well, yeah, but you're like the only orc that can read in the whole darn world for some reason and doesn't deserve to be slaughtered as a baby or whatever. So, yeah, these are, again, no, I'm not saying that here's another thing. I'm not saying those themes can't be in somebody's game. I am saying, however, that they should be an option, not a requirement. If people want to play, look, there are plenty of people who are whatever, white or people of color or whatever, who they might want to play a game with like difficult social themes,
murder,
or maybe they want to play a game in which they are bad.
They want to be gnarly,
or they want to play a game maybe that's like where they're the rebels fighting a slave empire, right? And so they want to like address slavery and how there's all this racism in the world. Some people enjoy that, and that's fine. But it shouldn't be like, well, you're not playing D&D if there isn't racism in it. It doesn't have to be like a baked in requirement in character creation. It should be like a storytelling option. That's all, right? So the people who want to play games like that, nothing changes, right? Nobody, the D&D police will not kick down their door and take their game away, right?
Right. Okay.
It's just if people want to play in a way that's more inclusive, here's how you do it.
Mm-hmm. And so talk about species. We talked about species also before. So like that, as someone was saying, okay, well, just call race species and that'll solve the problem.
Yeah. Changing the name from race to species to lineage, things like that. I think that's a nice start. But if you're just using another word to still say that there is a people that simply in virtue of their birth are evil and deserving of slaughter, or are savage and ignorant or uncivilized, you didn't really change anything, right? That's, in fact, if you go back and look at the way people talked about, about racism in the history, often they might not have used the word race. They'd say like the peoples of the New World are, or the peoples of Sub-Saharan Africa are. Well, they didn't use the word race. So whatever they are going to say, it can't be racist. No, that's not how it works. It's the concept that somebody can be good or evil savage or intelligent or civilized simply because of who their parents are. And that's not how the real world actually works. And all I'm suggesting is that being forced to role play that, some people don't like that. And so you don't have to if you don't want to.
Right. And the issue with species is that we've constructed a world where we have different, people of different races, quote unquote, whatever. We'll use your word, ancestries. We have people of different ancestries that are sentient and that with which we can interbreed. So like by calling something a species, you're basically, you're kind of throwing those two things out, and it's like, okay, here's another species. And like, no, then they probably don't have sentience because we only know one species in our world with sentience, human species. And then we can't breed with them. Humans can only breed with humans. But in these fantasy worlds, they have sentience and they can breed. So calling them species, that doesn't do anything, right? We still need to deal with the problem of different people that are different than us, who we can talk to, and with whom we can breed.
Yeah, I mean I think that's right. I don't think how changing the word to species doesn't help. And I don't think that thinking about it in terms of 21st century Earth science is necessarily I've had people say, well, that's unrealistic because in the rules that I wrote, you can mix and match species and cultures. And you could also have people from two cultures, two different ancestries have a baby. There's rules for like mixed ancestry children or mixed ancestry characters.
You can have like dwarf gnome baby.
Yeah, dwarf gnome or elf, elf orc or halfling gnome, that sort of thing. And like, well, why not? Why not? It's not just human and elf and human and orc. I mean, 4th edition and 3rd edition had half dwarves, half human, half dwarf. They're called mules, and they were in Dark Sun, right? One of the settings. So I mean, where would happen to them? Well, we just don't have those now. I think calling them mules isn't really the best name because that's a reference to a donkey anyway. But some people are like, well, that's not biologically realistic. And I want to ask them, are fire-breathing dragons biologically realistic? We're going to pull the scientifically realistic. This game has the wish spell, right? I can teleport instantaneously to anywhere on the same plane of existence. And you're telling me about the laws of biology? Come on. I think I can suspend my disbelief enough to allow somebody to have a character whose father was a dwarf and mother was a gnome. Like, that's not that weird. But people like to argue about it.
All right. So I think we've covered enough of the ground. Like, I mean, you try to talk to people, right? You try to like meet them where they are because I'm a person that tries to bridge gaps, and I want to continue to receive people's questions and have guests on that can kind of elaborate on some stuff. It gets to a point where it's like, okay, there's only so much we could do because we're trying to bridge an empathy gap, we're trying to bridge a perspective gap, and at this point, I feel like you have to like just extend the invitation. Look, we are trying to as best as we can to articulate our perspective. Right. Yeah. And it's a perspective you adopted because you don't necessarily naturally have that perspective. It's just something that you acquired again with your nurture, with your, culture and the way that you grew up and all that kind of thing. So like we are trying, people. We're trying.
Right. And right. I think that's why it's also one of the reasons why I try to make analogies to things that are going to be more familiar, like colorblindness or other situations where you're like, oh, well, I'm willing to make this simple change or accommodation to let people in that it seems non-political. It's just like, well, that's just being like a nice person, right. Or considerate of others or something. I don't see how this is all that different. And then also putting it in dollars talk, marketing. This is about getting a larger audience, which gives us a stronger hobby, which gives us more and better games. Who doesn't want that? Right. So that kind of helps push the, even if there's a little empathy shortfall, right? Gets you over the hump.
Yeah. At the end of the day, there's two walls. There's the don't take my stuff wall, and there's a don't tell me what to do wall.
Yeah,
right?
Fair.
So like, and the wall is like, okay, we're saying all this stuff. Does that mean we're going to cancel our stuff? Well, no. I mean, you have a product right here, Dr. Marshall, like really inspiring to me, the way he was able to take race and break it down, nature and nurture. You get the same thing, but we can flip between the nature and the nurture and kind of do that. That is not the technical definition of not cancellation. All you're doing is rearranging. And then, the don't tell me what to do. We don't want people who enjoy the basic stuff to say, we're not going to call them racist. We're not going to, say that you're bad. It's just, it's an invitation, right? It's an invitation to consider, to think twice, and to say, okay, are you really attached to this? Like, or what parts of it are you attached to? Like, maybe you're attached to certain, maybe, we can keep what you love and then take out like stuff that maybe you don't love so much. And, or you kind of hoarded the whole thing, but it's like, okay, take out this, and this, can we, and then like replace it with better stuff, and you can have the same thing.
Right. And the thing that I think a lot of people who really want to dig in their heels on this don't maybe not realize is, as I mentioned before, these ideas have been at least at play, present some of the time in the game since its origin. But like, if you want to see an example of what D&D with some of these things at least changed, look at Eberron. Eberron is one of the big settings. And guess what? There are nations of civilized orcs in Eberron, and an orc can be a wizard and can, or do whatever. So one of the great thing about Keith Bicker's Eberron is that they really kind of avoid a lot of those like stereotype tropes.
I think he intentionally went against a lot of the stereotypes with like the Orc nation and the traveling elves and the different things that have happened. Yeah. And
so, I mean, there's lots of, I think it's smart for us to want to facilitate stories like that. That's all. And
center them, that those are supplements, to actually bring them into the main core book.
Yeah,
right? That's the trick. They've been there the whole time. It's just not in the core book all the time.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's in Tasha's, some of those changes.
So talk about Tasha's a little bit. We can kind of start to, okay, what has been done now? So then, so you had, Black Lives Matter happened. The statement happened from WotC. You released your book at the same time, which, not like every single person who owned 5th edition has bought your book, but it's in the bloodstream, so to speak. And then I think it was a couple of months later, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, the supplement came out.
Yep. It came out in November. So it was like 6 months and 5 months after their statement. And it has a page and a half or so at the very beginning of the book that just basically says, hey, if you want to play a character that isn't the same as the race in the player's handbook, you can just put the ability score increases, like the +2 to intelligence, +1 to dex that a high elf might have, and just say, well, you know what, my high elf's going to be a tough high elf, so they're going to have a +2 to con and a +1 to wisdom or whatever. Okay, so Tasha's gives you rules to do that, and then it says you can take one skill proficient or tool proficiency and swap it out for another one, and you can change the language. That's what it says. Those are the rules you can do. See, race can be anything you want it to be. But, and that's a good start. And they say they're going to be making more changes in future books. There's an upcoming book in which the Drow are kind of reframed so that they're not biologically evil. It's culturally problematic. So that they're clearly aware and doing good work. The most recent couple books have continued. Candlekeep Mysteries has got a lot of great stuff in it and so on. So, and also I might add, fantastic list author teams. So lots of great people working on this stuff too, doing good jobs. But it's got some work to do because, of course, these are all supplements, but they're not going to issue. I don't expect them to put out a new 5th edition player's handbook that solves this problem, because they've worked pretty hard to allow those core 3 books to be really all you need to play the game. Right. And so, maybe that'll be fully integrated in 6th edition, whenever that is, which frankly, I hope is not for a while. 5th edition is doing great.
You could have, they did a 3.5.
They did, or they did in 4th edition, they had the Essentials line, right? Which are just kind of like edited and like streamlined versions of the original books. Right. So, they could give a 5th edition Essentials player's handbook, but I don't think they will. So, okay. There are things that I would have liked not to have appeared in the original 3 core books, or it's the player's handbook, but they're doing a decent job trying to fix those things. I do think that Tasha's isn't good enough because it lets you make the one exception character. It's like all the Drow are by nature evil, but you're the good Drow, or you're the smart, or the one like a civilized orc. So, not a big fan of that. And then B, it doesn't address the fact that just some of the traits are a little bit, you can't swap out. Like you can't, the rules, the creation rules, you can't change savage attacks because it's not a skill proficiency. So orcs are still by nature savage. And I'm not a big fan of using the word savage to describe any entire race of people. Right.
Savage equals biology is not good.
Right. That's big history there.
That now, if people want to really focus on something like the idea of savage, right, and the fact that that equals biology, that has a massive cultural lineage. And if you're going to be kind of ignorant about that, and it's like, no, you're putting it in there, like read up on how conquering people saw, native peoples who resisted. Like they're always savage, they're always warlike, they use these stigmatizing words, and always biologically by their inherent nature and their DNA, there are these things. And that is not something we want in our games. And by taking that out, we're not just taking the savage out. I think people say that's okay. Are orcs not gonna be savage anymore? It's like, cool. I think of course be savage. You can be savage as you want, but that comes from their heritage. It comes from their cultural heritage,
right?
Not from their ancestry.
Biology, right?
The only thing that comes from their biology is like the survival stuff, tusks.
Yeah,
right.
The physical stuff, like whether they have wings or not, like an Aarakocra, right? I mean, no, that's not going to be something that you can just swap around, right? And it shouldn't be, because you can if you really want to, but as part of the core of the game, Aarakocra have wings. That's fine.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. And so somebody will say, well, why is that okay? Right? Aren't you still being racist? Here's what I do and I mentioned this earlier in a kind of a clumsy way, that I think it's important for people that aren't necessarily members of marginalized groups to just spend a second listening to people who are talk about this, because they know what it's like in a way that I didn't. So when I listen to D&D players of color or whatever, you know what they say? They say the fact that Aarakocra have wings and Tritons have gills doesn't feel gross to me. It's not inappropriate. It doesn't make me uncomfortable. But if you're going to say that everyone born with that color skin is a savage, that's a little too close to, that reminds me a little too much of, the stories my grandfather told me that were why we were, suffered for centuries or something, right? Real world impacting things make them like, that kind of makes me uncomfortable. But so I say, well, if they say that's not cool, but this stuff is fine, I'm fine with to follow their lead.
Yeah. Dr. Eugene Marshall, this was amazing. Thank you so much for breaking stuff down. Have we missed anything? Is there anything, any part of your project that you talk a lot about or that you talk a lot about, or otherwise that we have missed in this conversation?
No, I mean, that covers the core stuff, right? That's kind of the argument I make at the essay at the beginning of the book. So.
And so you have different supplements that have come out since then. Talk about a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the core book is literally just the races from the core races from the player's handbook, one sub race per, and that's because of the legal way that Wizards of the Coast lets people use the D&D product through what's called the open gaming license. That's all I'm legally allowed to use. But I did issue, after that original book came out that has some adventures in it too, 4 or 5 books that have some total of maybe 140 or 150 homebrew races that are rather ancestries and cultures that are, many of them are obvious, let's say, homages or analogs to the published official races. So yeah, there's not Aarakocra because that's copyright Wizards of the Coast, but there are bird folk that are strikingly similar, and it's just the rules for how you would use them with this ancestry and culture system. And there's 5 supplements, so they're out there if you want. They're all on drive-through, and all very reasonably priced.
Bird folk, rock creatures, half demon creatures. You can have it all, people. We could have it all. It's just it's about how you do it. It's about how you do it. When when you clump it all in terms of this one word race, nature and nurture becomes a problem. When you can separate it out, that's where we can open up not only less harm overall, but better storytelling and more deeper storytelling. And to put it, and it's all there. All we're saying is put it in the main books and make that the front facing stuff.
Yeah,
not just in D&D, but this has been a very D&D centric conversation because Dr. Marshall is that's his heritage. But like we do it too in our board game. Like I see all these board games over here. Gloomhaven and the pandemic, like Legacy and all kind of stuff. This stuff we borrow from this stuff all the time. So I hope that people who may not have a specific D&D background can get a lot out of this conversation as a translator to what they're familiar with. So you have so Arcanist Press is more than this.
Yes.
But you have more stuff that going on. So maybe share a little bit more about what Arcanist Press is up to.
Oh, well, thank you. So yeah, though this was the big thing that we spent the past most of the year doing. But we've got a new project we're working with in partnership with Sigil Entertainment is another company that has a lot of art. It's an art studio to release a superhero game called S5E. It's kickstarting in a week. And that, from this recording at least, it's a tabletop role-playing game, superheroes, that uses the 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons rules, and it's completely compatible. So if somebody knows D&D, they could pick up this book, and you can play modern 21st century superheroes. And if the playtesters are right, then pretty much all of your favorite movie superheroes or comic book heroes you can kind of embody and duke it out in the streets.
How long does the project run?
I think it's going to be a 3 or 4 week Kickstarter. I wrote the book, and I'd been writing it for a year or two, probably around the same time as this other project started. But it went through several iterations. It's like a 300-page book, and there's also going to be a supplemental setting and monster book and all kinds of stuff. So the art is amazing. This is why we wanted to have Sigil Entertainment take care of this, because they are getting this art is like high quality comic book art, right? And the cover is by, speaking of one of my favorite comic book artists, Sanford Green, who is the famous artist and creator of Bitter Root. He won an Eisner last year. They're making it into a movie, and he's done like Black Panther and all kinds of fantastic work in the comic book world. So that's the next big thing for us.
So that's launching this coming Tuesday?
Tuesday, yeah, exactly right. A week, no, like 2 days, couple days. Oh my gosh. Wow, it's already the 20th. Right. The 22nd on Tuesday is launching, and that's going to go for a couple weeks.
We're gonna have to get this episode up there and get obviously whatever crossover people, whatever people are into the tabletop role playing experience, we can get the every backer counts. So if we can get a couple backers dropped it over there, then
hey, even if you just like comic book art, because this thing is going to be just packed with really awesome stuff.
All right, Arcanist Press, we're going to be hearing from them a lot apparently down the road, and hopefully for this stuff too, to get that closer to the core of the games we love. So Dr. Eugene Marshall, thank you so much for spending the time. Do not be a stranger, please.
Oh yeah, thanks so much.
If you could change your mind, you could change the world. So until next time, later everybody.